Ukridge and the Home from Home by P.G. Wodehouse. Somebody tapped on my door. I sat up in bed, electrified. Except for Macbeth, I should imagine that few people have ever been quite so startled by a nightly knocking. The hour was 3 a.m, and in London lodgings the sleeper is rarely awakened at such a time in such a manner. The door was now open, and I perceived, illuminated by a candle, the Roman Emperor features of Bowles, my landlord. Bowles, like all proprietors of furnished rooms in the Sloane Square neighbourhood, is an ex-butler, and even in a plaid dressing gown he retained much of the cold majesty which so intimidated me by day. "Excuse me, sir," he said in the reserved voice in which he always addresses me. "Do you happen to have the sum of 8 shillings and 6pence? 8 shillings? And 6pence, sir, it is for Mr. Ukridge." As he mentioned the name, his tone seemed to take on a sort of respectful affection. One of the mysteries of my life is why this godlike man, while treating me, who pay my rent regularly, with a distant hauteur, as if I were something very young and callow in baggy trousers, whom he had just caught eating the entree with a fish knife, should positively fawn on Stanley Fenshaw Ukridge, who is, and has been for years, a recognised blot on society. "For Mr. Ukridge?" "Yes, sir." "What does Mr. Ukridge want 8 and 6 for?" "To pay his cab, sir." "You mean he's here?" "Yes, sir." "In a cab?" "Yes, sir." "At 3 a.m? "Yes, sir." I could make nothing of this. As a matter of fact, mystery had enveloped all Ukridge's movements of late. I had not seen him for months, though I knew that in the absence of his Aunt Julia, the well-known novelist, he was residing at her house on Wimbledon Common as a sort of caretaker. The most mysterious thing of all was that I had received a letter from him one morning enclosing £10 in banknotes, part payment, he explained, of loans floated by me in the past, for which, he said, he could never be sufficiently grateful. Of this miracle he had given no other explanation than that his genius and opportunism had at last found the road to wealth. "There's some money on the dressing table." "Thank you, sir." "Did Mr. Ukridge mention what he thought he was doing, dashing about London in cabs at this time of night?" "No, sir. He merely inquired if I had a spare room and desired me to set out the whisky and soda. I have done this." "He's come to stay, then?" "Yes, sir," said Bowles with marked gratification. He looked like the father of the prodigal son. I put on a dressing gown and went into the sitting-room. There, as Bowles had foreshadowed, was the whisky and soda. I am not a great drinker in the small hours, but I felt it prudent to mix myself a glassful. I have generally found that on the occasions when S.F. Ukridge descends on me out of the void, it is best to be ready. The next moment the stairs shook beneath the clumping of heavy feet, and the man of wrath entered in person. "What on earth?" I exclaimed. My emotion was not unjustified. For the appearance of Ukridge I had been prepared, but not for his appearance in his present costume. Never a natty dresser, he had sunk now to hitherto unimagined depths. Above a suit of striped pyjamas, he was wearing the yellow mackintosh which has been his companion through so many discreditable adventures. On his feet were bedroom slippers. He had no socks. His whole appearance was that of one who has recently been caught in a fire. In answer to my exclamation, he waved a hand in silent greeting. Then, having adjusted the pince-nez which were attached to his outstanding ears by ginger beer wire, he plunged forcefully at the decanter. "Ah," he said, putting down his glass. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked. "Roaming about London in that costume?" He shook his head. "No roaming, corky old horse. I came straight as the taxi flies from Wimbledon Common. And why, laddie? Because I knew that a true friend like you would be sure to have the latch-string hanging out and the lighted candle in the window. How are you off for socks these days?" "I have a sock," I replied guardedly. "I shall need some tomorrow. Also shirts, underlinen, cravats, a suit, a hat, boots, and a pair of braces. You see before you, Corky, a destitute man, starting life all over again, you might say. What are you wearing those pyjamas for?" "The ordinary slumber wear of an English gentleman." "But you're not slumbering." "I was," said Ukridge, and it seemed to me that a look of pain flitted across his face. "An hour ago, Corky, or perhaps nearer an hour and a half. I was slumbering like the Dickens. And then he reached for the cigar box and smoked for a while, in a rather brooding manner. "Ah, well," he said. He emitted what I suppose was intended to be a mirthless laugh. "Life," he said. "Life, that's what it is, just life. Did you get that tenner I sent you, Corky?" "Yes." "I dare say it came as a bit of a surprise." "It did. When I coughed up that tenner, do you know what it was to me? A nothing, a mere nothing, a bagatelle, an inconsiderable trifle out of my income." "Your what?" "My income, old horse, a mere segment of my steady income." "Where did you get a steady income?" "In the hotel business." "What business?" "Hotel business. From my share of the proceeds of Ukridge's Home from Home. I didn't actually call it that, but that was how I thought of it, the home from home." Once more a cloud passed over his expressive face. What a bonanza it was while it lasted. "While," he repeated sadly, "it lasted. That's the trouble with these good things. They do not last. They come to an end. How did this one come to a beginning?" "My aunt suggested it. At least, when I say suggested it, it was like this, Corky. You know that now these talking pictures have come in, the studio people are scouring the world for blokes of either sex, capable of writing dialogue. It was but a question of time before my aunt was approached. She signed a contract to go to Hollywood for a year, and her last words, as she poked her head out of the boat train at Waterloo, consisted of instructions to me on no account to let the house in her absence. I dare say you know she had a horror of strangers in the home. I noticed it that time I was dining with you there, and she came in. Well, I give you my honest word, Corky, that up to that moment I had had not the slightest idea of doing anything but stay in the house and bark at burglars. I anticipated a quiet and reposeful year, during which I could look about me and try to find my niche. The butler and the rest of the servants were on board wages. I was assured of 3 square meals a day. The future, if placid, looked rosy. I was content. And then my aunt spoke those ill-judged words. I don't know if you are a student of history, Corky, but if you are, you'll agree with me that half the trouble in this world has come from women speaking ill-judged words. Everything is set and looks nice and smooth, and then along comes some woman with a few ill-judged words, and there you are. Upon my Sam, until my Aunt Julia delivered that parting speech with one elbow in the eye of a fellow passenger and the other arm waving authoritatively in my direction, the idea of turning the Cedars, Wimbledon Common, into a residential hotel had never so much as crossed my mind. This seemed to me to be on a major scale. I gasped reverently. "You turned your aunt's house into a hotel?" It would have been flouting Providence not to. There was big money in the scheme. If you're acquainted with the suburbs, you're aware that these residential hotels are springing up on every side. There is an ever-increasing demand for them. Owners of private houses find it's too much of a sweat to keep them up, so they hire a couple of Swiss waiters with colds in their heads and advertise in the papers that here is the ideal home for the city man. But mark the difference between joints like those and the Maison Ukridge. On the one hand, comparative squalor. On the other, luxury. You may not look on my Aunt Julia as a personal friend, Corky, but even you can't deny that she knows how to furnish a house. Taste, elegance, the dernier cri in refinement. And then the staff! No Swiss waiters here, but a butler, alone worth the price of admission. Parlourmaids trained to the last ounce. A cook in a million. Outstanding housemaids. A tweenie renowned throughout Wimbledon. I tell you that, as I tottered out of Waterloo Station to go to the nearest newspaper office and insert my advertisement, I sang. Not for long, because people began to look at me, but nevertheless I sang. You would have been surprised, Corky. I will go further. You would have been astounded at the number of replies I got. I had planned the terms on a liberal scale, for of course before floating an enterprise of this kind it had been necessary to square a butler, 2 parlourmaids, 2 housemaids, a cook, a tweenie, and the boy who cleaned the boots. Bloodsuckers to a man and woman. But in spite of that, half the population of London seemed anxious to chip in. The fact is, you see, Wimbledon Common is a good address. It means something, lends a lustre. The cognoscenti, hearing it, are impressed. You are one of these city blokes, and you meet another city bloke and say to him casually, "Drop in and see me sometime, old man. I am always to be found at the Cedars, Wimbledon Common," and he fawns on you and probably stands you lunch. So, as I say, I was flooded, positively inundated with requests to be allowed to sit in. All that remained to do was to throw the handkerchief. I bunged it eventually to a well-chosen 6, headed by Lieutenant Colonel B.B. Bagnew, late of the 4th Loyal Lincolnshires, and Lady Bastable, widow of one of those birds who get knighted up north. The rest were good, solid fellows who were busy being the backbone of England, but not so busy as to forget to settle up regularly every Friday night. They came trooping in, one by one, and presently the nest was full and the venture a going concern. "Well, it couldn't have been a bigger success," continued Ukridge. "Everything from the start was one grand sweet song. It was idyllic, Corky, that's what it was. I am not a man who speaks hastily. I weigh my words, and I tell you it was idyllic. We were just a great big happy family. Too often in the past it has happened that circumstances have compelled me to appear in the role of guest. But you can take it from me that nature really intended me for a host. I have the manner, the air. I wish you could have seen me presiding over the dinner table of a night. Suave, genial, beloved by all, a kind word here, a quick smile there, the aristocrat of the old school, nothing less. Talk about feasts of reason and flows of soul. A pretty high level the conversation round the board invariably touched. The Colonel had his anecdotes of India where he had served his country faithfully and well. Lady Bastable could tell you some good things about Blackpool in August, though sometimes, in a graver vein, she spoke of the clickiness of Huddersfield. And the others were all intelligent, active-minded men who read their evening papers in the train and were never without something sparkling to say about Brighton A's and the weather. And after dinner, the quiet rubber, the wireless, the murmur of pleasant talk, the occasional spot of music. Did I say it was idyllic? Well, it was. Here Ukridge helped himself to another whisky and soda and sat for a space, brooding. "My Aunt Julia," he resumed, "on these occasional absences of hers from the fireside, is never a great correspondent. At least she very seldom writes to me. The fact that I did not hear from her, therefore, occasioned me no concern. I assumed that she was doing her bit in Hollywood, basking in the pleasant sunshine and being the curse of such parties as she might attend. And apart from wishing that she had had the vision and enterprise to sign up for 3 years instead of 1, I scarcely gave her a thought. And then one afternoon, when I had run into London to lay in a fresh supply of cigars, I happened to meet her friend, Angelica Vining, the poetess in Bond Street. You may remember this bird, Corky? She was the one who wanted to borrow my aunt's brooch on a certain memorable occasion, but I was firm and wouldn't let her have it, partly on principle and partly because I had pawned it the day before. Since that episode, a certain coldness had existed, but she seemed to have got over it. She now beamed upon me, not without a toothy geniality. "I suppose you were delighted to hear the news," she said, after we had exchanged the customary civilities. "News?" I said, for she had me fogged. "About your aunt coming home," said the Vining. "Have you ever, Corky, during a friendly political discussion in a pub, been punched squarely on the nose?" Well, that's how I felt when I heard those words so casually uttered in the heart of Bond Street. We were standing outside the dog shop at the moment, and I give you my word that the 2 Scotties and the bulldog pup in the window suddenly seemed to become 4 Scotties and 2 bulldog pups, all shimmering. The ground rocked beneath my feet. "Coming home?" I gurgled. "Hasn't she written and told you?" "Yes, she's sailing home almost immediately." And as in a trance, Corky, I heard the woman relating the events which led up to the tragedy. And the longer I listened, the more solid did my conviction become that my Aunt Julia ought to have been chloroformed at birth. In that particular studio which had engaged her services, it seems a good deal of latitude is granted to the distinguished authors on the payroll. The kindly powers that be recognize the existence of the artist temperament and make allowances for it. If, therefore, my aunt had confined herself to snootering directions, harrying cameramen, and chasing supervisors up trees, nothing would have been said. But there is one thing the artist's soul must not do at the colossal superfine, and that is swat the main boss with a jewelled hand over the ear hole. And this, in a moment of emotion due to the fact that he had described some dialogue submitted by her as a lot of baloney that didn't mean a thing my Aunt Julia had done. And as a consequence she was now headed eastward, and according to the vining, expected home at any moment. Well, Corky, you have seen me in some tight places. You have observed your old friend, not once but many times, with his back to the wall and the grim, set smile on his face, and you have come, no doubt, to the conclusion that he is a hard man to beat. And so I am. But here was one occasion when, frankly, I confess I could not discern the happy ending. My course, you may say, was obvious. Frightful though the thought might be of closing down what was nothing more or less than a gold mine, there was nothing for it but to sling my guests out of the Cedars without delay, so that my aunt, returning to the old home, should find it swept and garnished, and with no signs of alien occupation. I saw that, of course, myself. I saw it in a flash. But the difficulty was, how the dickens was it to be done? You see, all my little group of squatters had watertight agreements and were legally entitled to stick on for 6 months, of which only 3 had expired. It wasn't a case of just walking in and saying, "Out you get, all of you." A problem of the trickiest. I didn't shine at the dinner table that night. Many were the comments on my preoccupation. For the first time, the genial squire of the Cedars was to be observed sitting distrait and silent and contributing nothing to the quips and cranks that flashed like lightning to and from across the board. After dinner, I withdrew into my aunt's study to do some more thinking. And then it occurred to me that, if 2 heads were better than 1, 9 would be better still. I was not alone in this enterprise, you will remember. The proceeds of the venture had been split up from the first, in proportions decided upon at a preliminary conference, between myself, the butler, the 2 parlour-maids, the 2 housemaids, the cook, the tweenie, and the boy who cleaned the boots. I rang the bell and instructed the butler to summon the shareholders for an extraordinary meeting. And presently in they filed. The boy who cleaned the boots, the tweenie, the cook, the 2 housemaids, the 2 parlour-maids, and the butler. The females got chairs, the males stood against the wall, and I sat on the desk and after a few formalities rose and explained the situation which had arisen. Considering what a bolt from the blue it was, I must admit that they all took it very well. True, the cook burst into tears and said something about the wrath of the Lord and the cities of the plain, she being a bit on the biblical side, and one of the housemaids had hysterics. But you have to expect that sort of thing at a critical meeting of shareholders. Somebody lent the cook a handkerchief, and the tweenie soothed the housemaid, and then we settled down to bend our brains to it. Of course, in a mixed gathering like that, it was to be foreseen that there would be a certain amount of dithering. Some of the suggestions offered were, frankly, goofy. And in saying this, I have in mind principally the boy who cleaned the boots. This stripling was a small, freckled lad who, after being dropped on the head when a baby, appeared to have spent the formative years of his life reading sensational fiction. You will scarcely credit it, Corky, but his idea of solving the problem was that we should all dress up as ghosts and scare the cash customers out of the place. And it will give you some inkling of the state to which I had been reduced by much thinking, that for a moment I actually toyed with the notion. Then the impracticability of the scheme of having a mob of 9 spectres of mixed sexes surging about the house swept over me, and I asked him to try again. This time he advised appointing a quorum to meet my aunt at Southampton and kidnap her and keep her imprisoned in a cellar somewhere till further notice. An attractive byproduct of this course of action, he pointed out, was that if you cut a toe or a finger off from time to time, she could be induced to sign large cheques which would do us all a bit of good. At this point the butler very properly took the child by the ear and slung him out. And after that things began to clarify. And finally it was agreed upon that a friend of the butler's should come to the house, posing as an inspector of drains, and condemn the system of the Cedars as unfit for human consumption. He had generally found, the butler said, that ladies and gentlemen were sensitive to adverse criticism directed at the drainage systems of the houses which they occupied, and his friend, he thought, would be happy to undertake the job for £1 down, his expenses both ways from Putney, and a glass of beer. And, nobody having anything better to suggest, this ruse was decided upon. On the following morning, accordingly, I went about sniffing in a suggestive manner and asking my guests if they hadn't noticed an odd smell. And in the afternoon, the butler's pal rolled up and got down to the agenda. I must pay a marked tribute to the butler's pal. In my opinion, he did his work well. There were moments when even I was almost deceived. He had just that rather dingy look and that drooping moustache which seemed somehow to go with drains inspecting. Add a black notebook and a peaked cap of vaguely official aspect, and you have a convincing picture. But the trouble in this life, Corky, is that you can never be sure when you won't come up against the man who knows, the nib, the specialist, the fellow who has studied the subject and has no illusions. By 7 o'clock, when our chap left, sniffing to the last, 5 of my 6 guests had been reduced to so admirable a state of mental collapse that it was plainly only a matter of moments before they started packing. And it was at this juncture that the 6th guest, a fellow of the name of Wapshot, returned to the fold. He had been spending the afternoon at the Oval, watching a cricket match. Now, in assembling my little family, Corky, I had taken no steps to ascertain their particular walks in life, contenting myself with bankers' references and the like. Imagine my concern, then, when this bloke Wapshot, on learning what had occurred, flung up his head like a war-horse at the note of a bugle and announced with flashing eyes that until his retirement from business 6 months before, he himself had been an inspector of drains and, what is more, well known as one of the keenest minds in the profession. Opening his remarks by relating a striking compliment which had been paid to his acumen and intuition by somebody high up in the drains world in the summer of the year 26. He said, with considerable heat, that if anyone was going to tell him there was anything wrong with the system at the Cedars, he would eat his hat. He exhibited the hat, a plush fedora. "Show me the man," he said warmly, "who says I have been living 3 months in a house without knowing if the drains were all right, and I will give him the lie in his teeth." And he went on to speak for a while of drains he had met, of drains which had tried to deceive him, and of the pitiful lack of success which such drains had enjoyed. Well, we couldn't show him the man, because he had had his glass of beer, trousered his quid, and left on a westbound bus an hour ago. But eager voices described his methods of procedure, and Wapshot simply scoffed. He absolutely scoffed, Corky. Apparently, there is a technique in drains inspecting. The expert can recognize the touch. For all his peaked cap, for all his notebook and drooping moustache, it was now plain that the butler's pal had betrayed his amateurishness in a dozen ways. He had done the wrong things. He had asked the wrong questions. Even his sniffing came in for criticism. "The fellow was an impostor," said Wapshot. "But what could his motive have been?" asked Lady Bastable. "Such a nice, respectable-looking man, too. He reminded me of one of the mayors of Huddersfield." Colonel Bagnew gave tongue. "I have wondered since if he could have been any relation of the boy who cleaned the boots." Both their minds ran on the same lurid, imaginative lines. "Advance man of a gang of burglars," said the Colonel. "Regular thing with these fellows. They send a chap on first to spy out the land, and then they come charging in, having been thoroughly informed of the topography of the house." For a moment, Corky, it seemed as if this suggestion were about to solve everything. The company reacted noticeably. 2 of the city blokes looked at one another in a sickly sort of way, and Lady Bastable turned definitely green at the gills. "Burglars!" she cried. "I shall leave immediately." And the 2 city blokes began to mumble something about how lonely and remote these houses on Wimbledon Common were, and how difficult it would be to find a policeman if you wanted one. And then the Colonel, silly ass, went and spoiled the whole thing. "Madam," he said, "be British. Gentlemen, be men. Are we to be scared from our comfortable home by a few paltry burglars?" Lady Bastable said she didn't want to be murdered in her bed. The city blokes said nor did they. In their own beds, that was to say. and I tried to push the good work along by saying that I couldn't imagine anything rottener than being murdered in your bed. But the Colonel had now got it thoroughly up his nose. You can never trust these old Indian Army men, Corky. Heroes, all of them, and it gets them greatly disliked. You little know these scoundrels if you think such a thing possible, he said. A craven crew. Show them a good old army revolver, and they run like rabbits. Lady Bastable said she hadn't got an army revolver. I have, said the Colonel, and my bedroom door is down the passage from yours. Rely on me, madam. At the first cry from you, I shall be out of my door and blazing away like Billy-O. That turned the scale. The company decided to stay on, and there was I with all the weary work to do over again. But it is at just these times when the ordinary man would be nonplussed, Corky, that your old friend comes out strongest. Peril seems to sharpen his intellect. Of course you may say that I ought to have thought of it from the first, and I admit the criticism is justified. Still, it wasn't an hour after the discussion I have just outlined before I got the idea which seemed to solve the whole problem. I saw now that, by fooling about and planning elaborate schemes to cast discredit on the drainage system of the Cedars, I had merely been scratching the surface. What I needed was to go right to the root of the things. I've studied human nature pretty closely, and I know one thing, viz., that however firmly he may be settled in, you can always dislodge the stoutest limpet by telling him there is infectious illness in the house. Colonel Bagnew might brandish his army revolvers and speak sneeringly of burglars, but I was prepared to bet that, if informed that the tweenie was down with scarlet fever, he would be out of the place so quick that you would only see a sort of blur going down the drive. I put this to the butler as a knowledgeable man, and after myself the heaviest shareholder, and he agreed with me in toto. He recalled to my mind the occasion when my Aunt Julia, woman of chilled steel though she is, had left the home on learning that one of the housemaids had mumps and kept on going till she reached Bingley-on-Sea, where she remained 3 weeks. It was arranged, therefore, that the tweenie should steal off privately to her mother's next morning, and that the butler, after going about looking grave and shaking his head ominously for a day or two, should come to me at a moment when I was surrounded by my little flock, and spring the big news. I previewed the scene over and over again, and could find no flaw in it. "Might I have a word with you, sir?" "Yes, Barter, what is it?" "I regret to have to inform you, sir, that Jane is far from well." "Jane? Jane? Our worthy tweenie?" "Indeed, Barter. This is certainly most regrettable. Nothing serious, I trust?" "Yes, sir, I'm afraid so, sir." "Speak out, Barter. What is it?" "Scarlet fever, sir, the doctor informs me." Sensation followed by immediate stampede of all. I didn't see how it could fail. However, it is always the unforeseen that pops up and upsets things. At tea-time on the following day, just as Barter had dished up the crumpets and withdrawn, shaking his head ominously, a wireless came from my aunt, dispatched in mid-ocean. And I want you to note this wireless very carefully, Corky, and to tell me if it did not justify me in doing what I did. It ran as follows: "Arriving in Paris Tuesday." That was all. Arriving in Paris Tuesday. But it was sufficient to cause me to alter my entire plan of campaign. Up to this point my every nerve had been strained to the task of dislodging the clientele. I now saw that to do so would be a grave blunder. Consider the facts, Corky. After deducting expenses and paying off my fellow shareholders, every extra week these people remained at the Cedars meant a matter of 30-odd quid in my kick. It would be madness to hoof them out until the moment arrived. And this wireless showed that the moment was far distant. You see, when my Aunt Julia goes to Paris, she always stays there at least a couple of weeks, this even at normal times, with the home she loves beckoning to her to return. How long, therefore, would she stay if she received a telegram informing her that the Cedars was ravaged with scarlet fever? I was convinced that I could reckon on being able to run my home from home for at least another month, which month would bring me in the colossal sum of about 120 solid o'goblins. There seemed to be no alternative. I went round to the local post office next morning and wired her at the Hotel Crillon, where she always stayed, and came back feeling at peace with all the world. The wire had run into money, for I had spared no words to make my meaning clear. But if you don't speculate, you can't accumulate. At dinner that night, no one had occasion to rally me on my preoccupation. It had just occurred to me that, when the time came to announce the scarlet fever, I could not only send these birds racing out of the house, but would probably be in a position to mulct them in heavy damages for breaking their legal agreements. The result was that I sparkled as never before. I had instructed Barter, in view of the changed conditions, to stop looking grave and to lay off the ominous head-shaking till I gave the word, so that there was not an unsmiling face about the board. The evening was voted by all one of our best and jolliest. The following day passed off equally well. Dinner was a perfect joy feast, and the others having retired to rest and not feeling particularly sleepy myself, I fished out a cigar and mixed myself a drink and went and sat in the study, trying to estimate how far ahead I should be when at length the good thing had to be closed down. And I may tell you, Corky, that I was in extremely sunny mood, as a man may well be who has snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and by his level head and vision has placed himself in a position to amass enormous wealth. Such were my meditations, old horse, and they were getting juicier and juicier every moment when, suddenly from somewhere upstairs, there came the sound of a shot, and then another. 2 shots in all. And something seemed to tell me that they were to be chalked up to the credit of Lieutenant Colonel B.B. Bagnew's army revolver. And sure enough, after a while, as I stood at the door listening for further manifestations, along came the Colonel, waving the weapon. "What was all the shooting for?" I asked. The Colonel was looking pretty pleased with himself. He followed me into the study and took a chair. "Didn't I tell you," he said, that chap who pretended to inspect the drains was the advance man of a gang of burglars? I was just dropping off to sleep when I thought I heard a noise on the stairs. I took my revolver and, stepping softly like a leopard, went out into the passage. And there, at the head of the stairs, was a shadowy figure creeping along. It was too dark to distinguish anything but a dim outline, but I blazed away. "Yes?" I said. "Yes?" The Colonel clicked his tongue, annoyed. "I must have missed," he said. "When I switched on the lights there was no corpse." "No corpse?" I said. "No corpse," said the Colonel. "I attribute it to the fact that the visibility was not good. In fact, we were in almost total darkness. I had the same experience once in Purundapore. Well, I looked around for a while, but I could see it was no use. The passage window was open, and I have no doubt the miscreant made good his escape that way. There is ivy on the walls, and he could have scrambled down without difficulty." "Did the fellow say anything?" "Yes," said the Colonel. "Odd that you should ask that. Just after I had fired the first shot, he said something that sounded like bah, bah, speaking in a curious, high-pitched voice. "Ba-ba," I said, a bit puzzled. It didn't seem to me to make sense. "That is what it sounded like. A loony burglar. He may have been snarling." "Do burglars snarl?" "Frequently," said the Colonel. He helped himself to a liberal spot and sucked it down with the air of a man who has borne himself in a fashion well befitting an ex-officer of a proud regiment. It struck me that it was strange that the house was so quiet. I should have thought my lodgers, hearing shots in the night, would have been buzzing about a bit, making inquiries. "Where are all the others?" I asked. The Colonel chuckled tolerantly. "Lying deuced low." Well, well," he said, "I suppose we mustn't blame them. Physical courage is a thing that comes naturally to some, not so readily to others. I was surprised myself that nobody seemed to have taken any notice of the little affair, so I went the rounds and found them all snug in bed. The bedclothes weren't actually over their heads, I admit, but it was a very near thing in 1 or 2 cases. Poor Lady Bastable was particularly upset. Apparently she has mislaid the key to her door. And now what? Shall we search the house? There doesn't seem much sense in that, does there? You say the bird escaped by the passage window. I think he must have done. Certainly he disappeared with the most extraordinary rapidity. One moment he was there, the next he had vanished. Well, I think one last spot, then, and to bed. Perhaps you're right, said the Colonel. so we had a final one and then parted for the night. At least we didn't part immediately because we were sleeping on the same floor. My room was at the head of the stairs next to Lady Bastable's, and the Colonel dossed at the end of the passage. I thought it only courteous as a host to tap at Lady Bastable's door as I passed, with a view to inquiring how she was making out. But there was such a frightful yelp of anguished fear from within at the first impact of my knuckles on the wood that I didn't proceed further in the matter. The Colonel had passed on to his well-earned slumber, so I went into my room and, donning my pyjamas, turned in. I was a little disturbed, of course, at the thought that burglars had been busting into the Cedars, but it didn't seem likely that they would come back as long as they thought the good old Colonel's ammunition was holding out. So, dismissing the matter from my mind, I switched off the light and was soon in a dreamless sleep. And there, Corky, if there was any justice in the world, if Providence really looked after the deserving as it ought to, the story should have ended. But did it? Laddie, not by a jugful. How long I slept I couldn't tell you. Possibly an hour it may have been, possibly more. I was aroused by a hand shaking my shoulder, and sitting up perceived that there was a female in my room. I couldn't see her distinctly, and I was just going to express my opinion of this lax and bohemian behaviour in a respectable house when she spoke. "Shush," she said. "Less of the shush," I replied a little warmly. "What are you doing in my room?" "It is I, Stanley," she said. "Corky, it was my aunt, and I don't mind telling you that for an instant reason rocked on its throne." "Aunt Julia!" "Don't make a noise." "But listen," I said, and I dare say my voice was a bit peevish, for the injustice of the whole thing was rankling very considerably. "You said in your wireless that you were going to Paris. Arriving in Paris Tuesday, you said." "I said arriving on Paris. The Paris was the boat I travelled by, and what does it matter?" "What did it matter?" "I'll trouble you, Corky. I ask you, old horse." Here was I, right up against it, with all my nicely reasoned plans gone phut, purely and simply because this woman hadn't taken the trouble to write distinctly. From time to time in the course of my life I have occasion to think some bitter things about women as a sex, but never had my reflections been bitterer than then. "Stanley," said my aunt, "Barter has gone mad." "Eh?" I said. "Who has?" "Barter. I arrived late at Southampton, but I was anxious to sleep in my own bed, so I hired a motor and drove here from the docks. I let myself in with my latchkey and crept upstairs as quietly as possible so as not to disturb anyone, and I had just got to the top of the stairs when Barter suddenly appeared and shot a pistol at me. I called out, "Barter, Barter!" and he must have recognized my voice, but he paid no attention whatever. He shot at me again, and I ran into your room and hid in the cupboard. Mercifully, he did not follow me. He must be off his head. Have you noticed anything odd, Stanley, about Barter while I have been away? Corky, you have often expressed admiration of my ingenuity and resource. What? Well, if it wasn't you, it was somebody else. At any rate, I have frequently received unstinted compliments for those qualities, but I can tell you I never deserved them so much as at that moment. For hanging on the very brink of destruction, as it were, faced by the fact that my aunt was actually on the premises, and that those premises housed a retired colonel, the widow of a knight from Huddersfield, and 4 assorted city blokes, I nevertheless kept my head and saw the way out. "Yes, Aunt Julia," I said, "I have noticed something odd about Barter. He has been going round looking grave and shaking his head in an ominous way as if he were brooding on something. The man is unquestionably potty. And this, Aunt Julia," I said, "is what you must do. This house is obviously not safe for you while he remains on the premises. You must leg it, and instantly. Don't wait, don't linger. Steal out now on tiptoe and execute a noiseless sneak downstairs and out of the front door. There are taxis at all hours of the night on the corner of the road. Take one and go to a hotel. Meanwhile, I will be dealing with Barter." "But Stanley," she said, and she spoke in a quavering, startled fawn sort of voice, which was music to my ears. I could see that she was deeply impressed by my intrepid courage, and it seemed to me that the whole episode might very well end in my not only escaping disaster, but actually making a most substantial touch. There is nothing that appeals to women more than the old bulldog grit in the male. Leave the whole thing to me, I said. This is man's work, Aunt Julia. The great thing is to get you away in safety immediately. But how will you manage, Stanley? What will you do? He has a pistol. That'll be all right, Aunt Julia, I said heartily. I have the situation well in hand. I shall send for him in the morning, apparently to discuss some trivial domestic matter connected with his buttling. Ah, Barter, I shall say nonchalantly. Come in, Barter. And then, when his attention is diverted, I shall make a sudden spring and overpower him. Quite simple. You may leave it all to me. Well, it was too dark to see the worshipping look in her eyes, but I knew it was there. I went to the door and peeped out. All was quiet in the passage. I took her hand, pressed it in an encouraging sort of way, and led her out. And then, just as we were moving nicely, Corky, what do you think? I can't go to an hotel without a suitcase, she said. There should be one in the cupboard in my room, and I can probably find some things to put in it. Corky, my heart stopped. Your old friend's heart stopped. You see, naturally, she being the only female in my troop, I had given Lady Bastable the best bedroom. My aunt's bedroom, in fact. The very one which my aunt was now reaching for the doorknob of. Her clutching fingers were within half an inch of the handle. Well, I did my best. You don't want a suitcase, Aunt Julia, I said. You don't need a suitcase. But it was no good. For the first time there crept into her manner something of the old austerity. Don't be a fool, she said. I am certainly not going to sleep in my clothes. And with these words, she turned the handle and shoved her arm in and found the electric light switch and bunged it on. And simultaneously from within there came the scream of a lost soul. Lady Bastable taking it big. And immediately after that there was a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and out came the Colonel from the room down the way and resumed his revolver practice where he had left off. The whole thing was extraordinarily like the big scene in one of those mystery plays. Well, Corky, I came away. I didn't wait. I could see no profit to be derived from lingering on. I nipped into my room, brushing aside the bullets, reached hastily for my mackintosh and legged it down the stairs, leaving them to settle things among themselves. I got out of the house, I found a cab, I took the cab, I came here, and here I am. And one thing, Corky, I want to say to you very seriously, as a man who has been through the mill and knows what he is talking about. Be very wary, old horse, of these opportunities of making easy money. As in the case I have just related, they too often have strings tied to them. You are a young fellow in the springtime of life, eager, sanguine, alert for every chance of getting something for nothing. When that chance comes, Corky, examine it well. Walk round it, pat it with your paws, sniff at it. And if on inspection it shows the slightest indication of not being all you had thought it, if you spot any possible way in which it can blow a fuse and land you eventually waist-high in the soup, leave it alone and run like a hare.